Hello and welcome to the UKSIF Leadership Podcast and our very special 12 Days of UKSIF-mas, where we will spend 12 days breaking down what we've been working on, big moves, and big news in the sustainable finance sector. I'm Madison Reamsbottom, Head of Governance and Strategy at UKSIF. Today I'm joined by Harry Burnham, our Public Affairs Manager. Yesterday we heard from Joe and James on the first day of UKSIF-mas about one general election. Harry is going to update us today, day two Prime Ministers. Harry, up until the 4th of July, Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister. Since then, we've had Keir Starmer, two Prime Ministers in 1 year. It's actually a bit of a reduction in churn compared to some recent years. Would you mind setting the scene for us?
Sure, thanks, Madison. So I guess the first thing to say is, given the size of the Labour majority that they won earlier in this year, we're unlikely to have a change of Prime Minister for some time. Although, interestingly, we have already seen the first calls for Starmer to resign and call another general election, with a huge petition already, which seems a little premature, but there we go. It's worth thinking about perhaps some of the similarities between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. Although they come from different parties, it's worth looking at. There's quite a few things between them that they share. So, for example, they both came into politics after having successful careers in well-paid professions outside of Parliament. Both of them are seen as technocrats rather than ideologues. They're not sort of tribal politicians, if you like. Both present themselves as serious politicians for serious times, and both inherited a mess from previous occupants of 10 Downing Street. I think it's fair to say both aren't natural politicians. They seem to have fairly poor political judgment on occasions, and arguably both have struggled to communicate what exactly it is their government is trying to achieve. And perhaps most importantly, both are very unpopular. Keir Starmer's personal approval rating is already down at something like -40.
Gosh.
He peaked just after the general election at around +10. I think if you were to compare it with the previous, the last time Labour won a landslide majority, I think Tony Blair's was about +40. So quite a big
Gosh.
difference there. And post-election, Rishi Sunak was at -37. So they're roughly about the same in terms of popularity.
I find that really interesting. I guess maybe I had a slightly different perspective of things. I wasn't quite so aware that they were both quite so unpopular. But given these similarities, I mean, have the two prime ministers inherited similar situations?
Yeah, I think we've got to be fair and acknowledge that both inherited very difficult situations. Rishi Sunak certainly inherited a difficult situation after Liz Truss and Boris Johnson. The Conservative Party was very divided and essentially in disarray after the Liz Truss premiership. The first thing and most important thing he had to achieve very quickly was to try and stabilise the UK economy after the mini budget, which had upset the city and spiked the price of government borrowing.
Chaos.
Um, it's also worth reflecting on the fact that when you become prime minister, sort of in a period without an election taking place, like Rishi Sunak did, Liz Truss did as well. That means you're quite tied to your predecessor's program for government and the manifesto that they set out in the general election, which limits the room you have for change. So presenting yourself as a new government is quite difficult if you're effectively just carrying on the policies from your predecessor.
Mhm.
However, I think for Rishi Sunak to have had a chance of winning in 2024, in the 24 general election, he probably needed to do a bit more to distance himself from what came before in Johnson and Truss, and set out an idea of what Sunakism actually was. He tried a few resets of of his government, but never really distanced himself, I think, from his predecessors, and never really seemed to settle on what it was he wanted to achieve. So he came from being Chancellor, and as Chancellor, he pledged to make the UK the world's first net zero aligned financial centre at COP26. But then, as Prime Minister, he decided to roll back various net zero commitments because of one by-election, which was actually Uxbridge, which was Boris Johnson's old seat. Um, Keir Starmer, looking at the situation he inherited, also very difficult. Again, looking at the public finances, what he inherited from the Conservatives certainly wasn't good. Although I'm not quite sure I believe the 22 billion black hole line that everyone in the Labour government has put out. I think some of the decisions they've made have contributed to that. But clearly, there was some work needed to be done to restore confidence in the UK economy, and the budget was their attempt to do that. But that has also created problems, such as the big farmers' protests we've seen, and
Yes.
perhaps more significantly for their growth mission, it's led to many businesses saying they will either have to make redundancies or hire fewer people because of changes to employer NICs, sorry, national insurance contributions. Starmer has already had to do one reset. Sue Gray, who was his chief of staff, is gone already, and he's had to replace her with Morgan McSweeney, who ran his election campaign. And I understand that there's another reset coming up, or has just happened, sort of redefining the missions for government. He's probably going to have to hope that he doesn't have any more resets to do, at least not for a while.
I can't imagine that would be good for his approval rating if he's constantly shuffling things around.
Certainly not.
Thanks for that, Harry Fab. If we're looking backward from a later date, what do we think history would say about Rishi Sunak?
I think people will be kinder to Rishi Sunak in future than they are now. As I said, he's inherited a real mess from Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. His room for maneuver was limited. He couldn't risk sort of upsetting any wing of the Conservative Party too much. Otherwise, he would have been ousted. And in fact, there were always rumours during his premiership that there were, various plots going along to actually get rid of him as leader and replace him with someone else. Also, we can't ignore that many of the problems he faced came from major world events that weren't actually in his control. So, looking at Ukraine, the COVID pandemic, energy price spike, none of those were his fault. And being fair to him, alongside Jeremy Hunt, he did restore, I think, a sense of calm after the mini budget. The price of borrowing came down again. He had some policy wins. Fairly quickly, he was able to improve relations with the EU and get an improved agreement over the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was the Windsor framework. He didn't really get much credit for that in the press or anywhere else, which he perhaps felt a bit aggrieved about. But equally, I think it's important to say again, he never really sort of set out what he was trying to achieve. He sort of started off presenting himself as a change candidate without really spelling out any clear change. He also tried to present himself as the person who would take sort of the long-term decisions in the national interest. But then one of his enduring policy legacies is he cut HS2, which he announced in Manchester that he was cutting the leg up to Manchester, which was another strange choice. So I don't think he has much of a sort of political legacy. Another weird thing is he set out that he was going to ban smoking with a sort of changing age. So I think it was something like anyone born after, I don't know, 2022, sorry, 2002 would never legally be able to smoke. But that actually got cut because of when he called the election. But yeah, I think on the whole, people will remember him as vaguely competent, calmed things down at a time when it was really important that happened because we could have had an economic crash without it.
Interesting analysis. It sounds a bit stop-start, but I think hearing the word calm and calming iterated in this
Hmm.
context is quite comforting. So if we're thinking along the same lines with Labour, how are we feeling so far as government gains momentum?
Uh, I think we have to say at the start that it's still early days. What is it, 5 months since the election, something like that? But definitely not been a smooth start for Keir Starmer and his government. He's already polling worse than Rishi Sunak was at his lowest level of popularity. And, people will always say it doesn't matter this far out from the next general election, which is true. Things can turn around. But he will have to really change things. He will have to improve how voters perceive him and his government. Otherwise, all the Labour MPs with small majorities, and it is a lot of the 420 odd MPs he's got have got very small majorities.
Right.
They'll start getting very nervous as we get nearer to the next election and start listening less to what the leadership is telling them to do, which will
Right.
make it even worse for them. We've already had lots of negative press headlines sent around sleaze. So we had the whole freebie gate with free suits and glasses, Taylor Swift tickets, that sort of thing. And there was also a sort of sense of sleaze around some of the appointments that they made. Some sort of internal Labour Party figures are now civil servants, which
Mm.
isn't how we understand the civil service should be run. There was internal discord, which was being leaked from Number 10 to the press. And that was related to why Sue Gray is no longer chief of staff. Apparently, she fell out with various other special advisors. They were briefing against her, which is never a good sign. I think there's a sort of general concern that Keir Starmer and the people around him lack political nous. So they've made some weird political decisions early on, which has caused them lots of problems. So, for example, the cut to winter fuel payments for all but the very poorest pensioners doesn't really raise much money, and it's very controversial. And as we've got cold weather coming in again, we can expect that to sort of rear its head in the press over the next few weeks and months.
Mm.
The biggest thing I think which has sort of captured the press negatively is the changes to farmers' inheritance tax. Big protests in London recently. Again, it's a change that doesn't really raise much money, and they may potentially have to U-turn over that.
It does beg the question of why they made those decisions in the first place.
There's a sort of suspicion around punishing people who didn't vote for them.
Mm.
I mean, traditionally, farmers would have voted Conservative, as would pensioners. You can sort of look at it in the same sort of vein as the private school VAT tax.
Right.
You know, typically you wouldn't assume people who send their kids to private school are voting Labour. So, there might be something in there. Um, Equally, they might have just felt they're good ways to raise money uncontroversially, but that was also wrong. So I don't know really. Um, but there have been some good things as well. We have to be fair and note that. They've done quite well politically in laying the blame for most of the problems that the country faces at the Conservatives' door. They keep saying, we've got in after 14 years of Tory failure, that sort of thing. I think lots of people are still giving them the benefit of the doubt on certain things. One of the departments that we're particularly interested in, energy security and net zero, has been quite positive. Lots of good things coming out of there. The Secretary of State, Ed Miliband, has made some pretty good progress. He increased the budget for the Contracts for Difference, which led to a very successful auction round for new renewable projects. He overturned the effective ban on onshore wind, approved some large solar farms, established Great British Energy, and announced 22 billion of funding for carbon capture clusters. The government has also launched some big reforms of the UK's planning process, which is something investors regularly complain about. They've set out a consultation on changes to the National Planning Policy Framework, or the NPPF, in England to speed up the planning process, and that will be quite crucial in getting their 1.5 million homes built over the Parliament as they pledged to.
Mhm.
They've launched a consultation on introducing a long-term rent settlement for social housing providers, which would give them longer-term certainty over income and make it easier for them to attract investment, build new homes, and retrofit existing stock. They had a very successful investment summit. What was that, about a month ago, 2 months ago, where they attracted, I think it was over 60 billion of investment in sort of new deals for the UK, which is, not to be sniffed at.
That felt almost like a surprise success as well. I feel like I didn't really see that coming.
Yeah, so there was a lot of concern in the build up to it, actually, that it wasn't going to go very well. There was, one of the stories was that they hadn't actually appointed an investment minister, which I think they did 2 days before it or something, which I suppose you could argue is just in time. There was another story about the operator of P&O ferries, who
Yes.
previously Labour people had been quite critical of. The Transport Secretary at the time, Louise Haigh, made some unhelpful comments. They sort of then said, well, actually, we won't invest in the UK then. But they were able to sort that out, and I think they announced something like a 1.5 billion investment. So, yeah, on the whole, it was quite successful. But as you say, perhaps a bit of a surprise. Um, there are also some areas where, some progress has been made, but perhaps things could be a little bit better. Um, they talk a lot about growth and investment, which is all very positive, and I think companies welcome it. But I think we need to see a clearer vision from the government of why investors and companies should choose to come here. The focus on growth is very welcome, but they spent a lot of time talking about sort of all the challenges the UK faces and how bad the situation is. I think that's undermined some of the confidence. The government has
Agreed.
started a pensions review, which for us is very positive. Big chance for the sector to get sort of more investment into productive sectors of the economy. They've published the interim report already and set out some important steps, such as consolidating smaller pension funds together to allow for greater productive investment in the economy. But from our perspective, there was no mention of sustainability at all in the first phase of the review. So that was a bit of a concern. There's also quite a large concern about this idea of mandating what pension funds can invest in. And basically, everyone is saying that's a terrible idea. They
I'm
haven't
hearing it a
quite
lot from our members regularly, day to day.
Absolutely. And they haven't really sort of killed off the idea that that might happen. So that's something we're pushing quite hard on for them to do. They've launched the National Wealth Fund, which is their sort of equivalent to things like we've got in Norway, Saudi Arabia, that sort of thing. And that's a positive step. Lots of our members sort of broadly welcome that. But there needs to be more sort of clarity of what it's actually going to do and how it's going to fit in with other public finance bodies. So we've got, GB Energy we mentioned, but then there's the British Business Bank, that sort of thing. And then I guess the last thing to touch on is investor sentiment. Madison,
Mhm.
what have you picked up on from our members around this?
Well, I think you mentioned a couple of really interesting pieces. And so, with me being out and having quite a few conversations day to day with our member firms directly, I think that concern about the potential to mandate investment into the UK is quite alarming. I think it flies in the face of interpretation of fiduciary duty in many ways. I
Absolutely.
think one of the things that we're always quite clear on is that we want our members to be able to have their own in-house proprietary approach, and it should be up to them how they invest. I think another piece of that conversation is the best way to make to bring investment into the UK is to make the UK investable. Make the UK investable, and this is something that you touched on as well as some of the things that could be better. Policy consistency in order to
Yeah.
encourage investment into the UK. But also, I think we're probably lacking quite a few options for investment projects. So if they're consolidating all of these pension funds and there's more money available, where's it going to go? Do we have enough projects, enough to put that capital
Yeah,
into?
that pipeline.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think exactly what you just said. I think there's still some worries out there that certain sort of building blocks aren't in place, I guess.
Mm,
Businesses were I think, quite welcoming of the new Labour government when they came in. They'd spent a
mm,
lot of time building relations with the business community, and you saw lots of businesses coming out for Labour, which perhaps traditionally they wouldn't have done. But I think there's a worry that some of that goodwill has been squandered. I think people on the whole are still happy that we now have what is, in theory, a stable government. A big majority
yes.
provides that sort of stability that investors really look for in a country, especially if you were to compare us with other countries in Europe at the moment. France is having troubles, Germany's having troubles, even the US. That's not exactly a stable situation, without naming names. So that's a positive for the UK, but I think there is a bit of work to do on setting out why you'd want to invest in the UK. And I think there needs to be a bit of sort of work done to reassure businesses, especially after the budget.
Mm. I think clarity on that NPPF, I'm hoping that that really helps boost investor confidence as well once we get some clarity on planning permissions processes.
That should help quite a bit, I think.
Fabulous. All right, Harry, this has been brilliant. Thank you for the breakdown. And thank you to all of you for joining us on day 2 of the 12 days of UKSIF-mas. And don't forget, tune in tomorrow for day 3. Remember to like and subscribe to hear more from us soon.